What? It is good to be back on campus. I was talking to my assistant Dustin as we were driving up, and how long had it been? It had been 2 years. It was before the pandemic that we were here. Seems like forever ago, but it's bringing back some fond memories. I'm very proud of the relationship that the Cherokee Nation has with Oklahoma State University. Now, I graduated from that other university down the road, but I am so proud of Oklahoma State University and its commitment to Native students. And I'm also proud of, again, the partnership that we've developed. The first med school in the history of this country, in Indian country, is Oklahoma State University in Tahlequah. I'm proud of that, and I think every American Indian in this country ought to be proud of that. That's a sign of progress. And there are a lot of distinguished alumni that have worked for the Cherokee Nation, have served the Cherokee people, and many more to come. We've got Tiny Glory Jordan and Rex Jordan. Tiny Glory Jordan is our Secretary of State. She's held many other positions, and Rex Jordan is a member of the Council of the Cherokee Nation. I want to recognize them, graduates from Oklahoma State University. And I am also so impressed with this center on campus. I mean, it is a remarkable sign of the times when a university of the caliber of Oklahoma State University commits itself to Native students, not just to Native students, but to developing leaders. And I just think that's something that we in tribal nations ought to get behind. And I do want to make an announcement that today Cherokee Nation will be making a donation to the Center for Sovereign Nations at Oklahoma State University in the amount of $100,000 today. Now, that donation is brought to you by the people who lost at the Hard Rock Casino in this past year. But there are no losers at the Hard Rock. It's the best gaming venue in the region. But it is also a sign of progress for Indian nations that we're able to not only commit ourselves to our own programs and services, doing those programs and services at record levels in terms of funding and also expertise, leading the way in so many areas, including education, but we are also in a position to reach out to our friends and neighbors, including Oklahoma State University, and help when we can. And we think those are dollars well spent. I want to visit with you a little bit today about the great hope that I've got for this graduating class and really all Native Americans of this generation. Probably every person of every generation, or just someone in every generation, as long as mankind has been doing things and accomplishing things, probably thought they were part of a significant generation. And in some ways, that's probably a true statement. But there is something about this generation of Native students that I think is special, and I dare say maybe the most important generation of Native Americans that really has come up in our history, or at least in many, many centuries. I mean, think about it for a moment. This century that we're in, and we're closing in, it's hard to imagine how fast time is passing. We're closing in on the first quarter of the 21st century. Now think about this century and compare it to the 500 years that came before it. You would have to go back over 500 years, over 5 centuries, to find a time when Native peoples weren't staring down, frankly, the barrel of disestablishment, of dispossession, that we weren't faced with things like our forced removal or the destruction of our governments and our other institutions. Frankly, you'd have to go back well before 5 centuries to find a time when we weren't threatened by things like genocide. You'd have to go back a long way to a time when young natives weren't looking forward into a century in which at best it was uncertain and at worst it looked like their peoples might not make it. And we know across those 5 centuries a great deal has been lost. A great deal of Native Americans have been lost. A great number of Native peoples in their entirety have been wiped off the face of the earth just on this continent. Native languages vanished, tribal lands conceded, tribal lands shrunk, tribal resources taken, people forced across the country, people like my people, and this is a story that's unfortunately played out many times in the 19th century, rounded up in stockades, marched across the country. That was the future for so many young natives in the past 5 centuries. Even in the 20th century, within living memory of people in this room, some native peoples in this room, within living memory of some of the parents and grandparents of the graduates here today, was a period in the 20th century in which my grandfather, a full-blood Cherokee, as proud a Cherokee as you would ever know, a World War II veteran, an iron worker, lived in a time in which the government of the United States would not allow him or his fellow Cherokee countrymen to even vote for the chief of his own nation. Most of his life, he would have never imagined his grandson, actually all of his life, he probably would have never imagined his grandson would someday be the elected chief of the Cherokee Nation, because he lived in a time in which most of Indian country was still so suppressed. And ladies and gentlemen, that was in the 20th century. It's only been within the past 40 or 50 years that the government of the United States had the good sense to finally, and I can't say it in a more charitable way, take its boot off the neck of Indian country and allow tribes to do what any people want to do, which is to self-identify and govern themselves and chart their own destiny and stay together as peoples, people that have existed and hung together from time immemorial. It's only been in the last 40 or 50 years. But most of the 20th century was marked by still great uncertainty, still great destruction, still great dispossession. I mentioned my grandfather couldn't vote for a chief. That's because the President of the United States appointed the chief of the Cherokee Nation. They had disbanded the legislative branch of the Cherokee Nation. They had abolished our courts. They almost wiped us out, as they almost wiped out hundreds and hundreds of tribes across this country. It's a good thing that our ancestors, not just our Cherokee ancestors, but the ancestors of every tribe represented here and many other tribes of the more than 500 tribes in this country, it's a good thing our ancestors had such grit and such determination, and it's a good thing that from time to time we had great friends and allies across the United States and around the world. Or we might not be gathered here today celebrating your accomplishments. I may not be standing here today. There might not be an elected chief of the Cherokee Nation. My friends, there might not even be a Cherokee Nation. The history books might be full of footnotes and paragraphs of Indian nations that were great and once were, but are no longer. That's how close we came over 5 centuries. This generation, the young men and women that we're celebrating today, are, I think, the most unique ever, but certainly the most unique in over 5 centuries. They are looking forward to the rest of the 21st century, and they will spend their professional lives, the rest of their lives, in most of this century full of promise. But they are looking down a century in which they're not seeing these acts of dispossession, these destructive policies towards our governments. And it doesn't mean they have it easy. It just means that after all this time, after such great sacrifice and perseverance of their ancestors, they are poised to do what their ancestors could not do because there was too much suppression, too much oppression, and too much dispossession. And that's a very special time to come of age, and that's the time that you all are coming of age. The opportunities to serve your fellow Native American, to serve your tribe, to do great things for your people are in your possession like they've not been for at least 5 centuries. That's a great deal of pressure, but it's also a tremendous amount of opportunity. All of that is coinciding with a century in which the rate of knowledge of all of humanity is growing at such an exponential rate. They measure it in different ways. They said at the turn of the 20th century, human knowledge doubled about every 100 years, and now it doubles about every 12 months. If that's a true statement, what a remarkable time it is to be alive. What a remarkable time it is to think about an optimistic future in which so many of the things that plague us today, whether it's problems surrounding our health, whether it's disease, whether frankly it's war, and it's still with us today, we know that around the globe, whether it's problems with technology, problems with inequality, problems with poverty, problems with education, it feels like it's within the grasp of this generation to conquer so many of those problems and to harness so much of the knowledge and the goodness that is out there to do such great things. Now, these things are happening at the same time. This century of such great hope for Indian country. Now, it doesn't mean it's all just lovely. It's not all just wonderful. There are still enemies of sovereignty out there. There are still reasons to be vigilant. It doesn't mean we're home free. It doesn't mean that right now we should forget that in the Supreme Court of the United States, they're deciding the fate of the Indian Child Welfare Act, a law that was put on the books in the 1970s to keep little Indian boys and girls from being adopted away from their homelands. Doesn't mean those things aren't under threat. It doesn't mean that the McGirt case, the most historic and important Supreme Court case in more than a century, isn't still under attack. We've got lots of great friends across this state in key positions, political positions, business positions, and across the country, but it doesn't mean there aren't still a few regressive leaders in our midst. There's at least a couple of leaders in this state that still think that it is 1822, not 2022. But for most of our friends and neighbors, they have seen the wisdom in Indian policies that let Native peoples be free and to govern themselves. They've seen that they actually profit alongside us, that they prosper alongside us. And so that's another reason this century is a century of great hope, because we've got so many friends and neighbors, notwithstanding that there's a few regressive leaders left. But that philosophy that tribes ought to be just stamped out, and that's how you solve the Indian problem, that philosophy is in its death throes in the 21st century. So you all are coming into your careers at a time where you can do so much good, and there's so much good that needs to be done. Now, I think the way that you can best seize the moment, and you all have your career plans, and I wish you well, but find time in your careers to serve your people. And there's lots of ways to do that. My guess is you've all found ways to do that already. And you've done it on this campus because this is a campus that fosters that kind of feeling that you ought to serve your people. But you've got a lifetime and a career to do the same. I want to encourage you all to get into public service. It is, I think, a high calling, and Indian tribes need the best and brightest of this generation to come serve. Because I can tell you right now, the most progressive and dynamic governments in this country are the Indian nations. If you want to be a part of a government of efforts to conquer those things I talked about, problems in poverty, problems in education, to make breakthroughs in healthcare, to craft public policy that ensures equality for everyone and ensures prosperity for every community, particularly those little rural communities that many of us came from and many of us want to go home to. You all have an opportunity to do that. Ladies and gentlemen, we can look on these graduates with such great hope. Many of you here are family members, no doubt, of these graduates, and I know you're proud. Well, think about your ancestors and think about what they faced. And think about the discouragement they must have had when they were young. Think about people like my grandfather who didn't even imagine voting for a chief because the government had taken that away from him. And think about this generation. This generation has an opportunity to do things like no generation before it. And I think that we all ought to give them a round of applause because this generation can change Indian country for the better. And I'm just glad to bear witness to their work in the years to come. Thank you all very much. What